People don't destroy your reputation with lies. They destroy it by convincing everyone the truth no longer matters. The first time I realized an entire town could decide who I was without ever asking my name, the church bells were ringing for Sunday morning service. Maplewood wasn't the kind of place where strangers stayed strangers for long. Every smile carried a memory. Every handshake came with a history. Every whisper eventually found its way to every front porch before sunset. I had spent 27 years believing that made this town feel safe. I was wrong. My phone began buzzing before I even poured my first cup of coffee. One notification became 10. 10 became 50. Friends who had never texted before suddenly remembered my number. Parents from my second-grade classroom canceled meetings they had scheduled only 2 days earlier. The local community page filled with comments faster than I could read them. Some people claimed they felt betrayed. Others insisted they had always suspected there was something dishonest about me. The strangest part was that nobody actually knew what had happened. They only knew someone else sounded certain. I stood in my tiny kitchen wearing fuzzy socks, holding a coffee mug that had suddenly become too heavy for one hand. Outside my apartment window, October leaves drifted across the empty sidewalk while the morning sun painted the maple trees gold. Everything looked exactly the way it had looked yesterday. Only my life had changed overnight. My name is Claire Bennett. I teach second grade at Maplewood Elementary. My biggest weekly excitement used to be deciding which library books my students would borrow on Fridays. I baked blueberry muffins for my elderly neighbor every other weekend. I volunteered at the animal shelter twice a month. I had never been arrested, never cheated on anyone, never chased attention. Somehow, by 8:30 that morning, I had become the woman everyone warned each other about. The accusation spread without a face attached to it. People repeated the story differently every time it changed hands. Some claimed I had broken apart an engagement. Others insisted I had been secretly dating a wealthy businessman from the city. By lunchtime, someone online confidently declared I had manipulated families for years. Facts disappeared beneath certainty. The more unbelievable the story became, the more eagerly people shared it. I drove to school anyway because children deserved teachers who showed up, even when adults forgot how to behave. My old Honda rolled through familiar streets where neighbors suddenly found fascinating reasons to look away. Mrs. Parker, who had hugged me at the grocery store 3 days earlier, turned her shopping cart toward another aisle before our eyes could meet. Two fathers standing outside the bakery stopped talking the second I crossed the street. Their silence somehow hurt more than words ever could. I parked beside the playground and rested both hands on the steering wheel. My breathing had become shallow without me noticing. Maybe this would all disappear once people realized the story made no sense. Maybe someone would ask me what really happened. Maybe truth still counted for something. I reached for my school ID, opened the driver's door, and stepped into the crisp morning air, completely unaware that across the street, behind the tinted window of a black luxury sedan waiting at a red light, a man named Adrian Romano had just looked up from an important phone call, watched the entire scene unfold in absolute silence, and noticed one detail nobody else cared enough to see. I walked through the front entrance expecting the familiar chorus of children laughing before class, but the hallway sounded different that morning. Conversation stopped a fraction of a second before I passed. Teachers who usually greeted me with warm smiles suddenly found bulletin boards fascinating. One of the office assistants looked up from her computer, opened her mouth as if she wanted to say something, then quietly lowered her eyes. The silence followed me all the way to my classroom. I unlocked the door, switched on the lights, and forced myself into the routine that had carried me through every difficult day of my career. Morning worksheets. Attendance sheets. Colored pencils lined neatly in plastic containers. Tiny chairs pushed perfectly beneath tiny desks. Children deserved consistency, even when adults surrendered to chaos. By 8:15, my students began arriving. They rushed inside carrying oversized backpacks and stories about soccer practice, loose teeth, and family dogs that had learned new tricks. Their excitement wrapped around me like a warm blanket, reminding me that children rarely judged before asking questions. They simply accepted the person standing in front of them. For almost an hour, I almost forgot about my phone resting face down inside my desk drawer. Then the principal appeared at my classroom door. Margaret Collins had been my mentor since my first year of teaching. She normally smiled with her entire face. Today, only her eyes showed kindness. "Claire, could you step into my office during recess?" she asked softly. I nodded without asking why, because I already knew. The meeting lasted less than 10 minutes, although it felt much longer. She folded her hands across her desk before speaking. "Several parents have called this morning. They are concerned about the rumors circulating online." Rumors. Such a harmless-sounding word for something capable of dismantling a person's life. "You know, none of it is true," I answered quietly. She looked at me with genuine sadness. "I do. But the school board wants time to review everything. I am placing you on paid administrative leave until this settles down." My heart sank, not because I feared losing my paycheck, but because 22 children would walk into room 12 tomorrow expecting their teacher and find a substitute instead. I packed my personal belongings in a cardboard box while the final bell echoed through empty hallways. Construction paper flowers my students had made for me only last week suddenly looked like memories from another lifetime. As I carried the box toward the parking lot, I noticed someone had taped a folded note beneath my windshield wiper. I hoped, foolishly, that it might contain encouragement. Instead, 5 handwritten words stared back at me. "People like you never change." There was no signature. No explanation. Just judgment wrapped in anonymous ink. I crumpled the paper before anyone could see my hands shaking. Across the street, inside the same black luxury sedan I had not noticed that morning, Adrian Romano remained parked beside a quiet coffee shop. His meeting had ended 20 minutes earlier, yet he had not driven away. He watched me place the cardboard box into the trunk of my aging Honda. He watched me stop for an elderly crossing guard struggling to gather papers scattered by the wind, even though tears shimmered in my eyes. Most people saw a scandal. Adrian noticed that a woman supposedly capable of betraying everyone still paused to help a stranger before helping herself. For the first time that day, a single question interrupted the endless business calculations inside his mind. What if the entire town had chosen the wrong person to condemn? I drove without knowing where I was going until the familiar streets of Maplewood slowly gave way to quiet country roads lined with red barns and fading cornfields. The radio stayed off. My phone continued vibrating in the passenger seat, but I refused to look at it. Every notification felt like another stranger deciding my life deserved a public vote. I finally pulled into the parking lot of Willow Creek Animal Rescue, a place where abandoned dogs never asked why you looked exhausted before deciding whether they trusted you. I had volunteered there every other Saturday for almost 3 years. Today was Wednesday, but I needed somewhere that still felt honest. The scent of fresh hay and cedar greeted me the moment I stepped inside. A golden retriever named Murphy spotted me immediately and bounded across the room, his tail sweeping against every kennel gate in celebration. He had no idea the internet believed terrible things about me. He only knew I had once scratched behind his ears until he fell asleep against my shoes. I knelt beside him, burying my face into his soft fur as tears I had spent all morning holding back finally escaped. They were quiet tears, the kind that came from exhaustion instead of panic. "Rough day?" asked Linda, the shelter director, as she carried a bucket of dog food toward the feeding area. She was nearly 70, with silver hair tucked beneath a baseball cap and the calm voice of someone who had spent decades rescuing creatures nobody else wanted. I quickly wiped my face. "Something like that." She looked at me for a long moment before smiling gently. "Well, the dogs still think you are their favorite person. That has to count for something." It counted for more than she realized. For the next 2 hours I cleaned kennels, refilled water bowls, folded blankets, and walked nervous rescue dogs around the fenced yard. Nobody asked uncomfortable questions. Nobody whispered when I passed. Even the volunteers who had probably seen the same rumors treated me exactly as they always had. Their kindness felt almost unfamiliar after the morning I had survived. As the afternoon sun dipped lower, I carried a frightened beagle outside for fresh air. He hesitated beside the gate, trembling at every passing truck before finally taking one careful step after another. Sometimes the hardest part is believing it is safe to keep moving, I whispered more to myself than to the dog. Across the gravel road, a black luxury sedan rolled quietly to a stop beneath the shade of an old oak tree. Adrian Romano remained behind the wheel, unnoticed. He had originally followed a financial lead into Maplewood that morning, but something entirely different now held his attention. He watched Claire kneel in the grass beside the frightened beagle instead of pulling impatiently on the leash. He watched her sit on the ground until the little dog gathered enough courage to walk beside her willingly. Power had introduced Adrian to thousands of people over the years. Most revealed their true character when they believed nobody important was watching. Claire Bennett believed she was completely alone, yet she still treated broken souls with extraordinary patience. Adrian reached for the leather notebook resting beside him and wrote only one sentence before closing it again. She behaves exactly the same in private as she does in public. That single observation bothered him more than any rumor he had heard because men who survived by reading people rarely ignored contradictions. As Claire carried the sleepy beagle back inside the shelter, she never noticed the sedan pulling silently onto the highway. She also never realized that somewhere between watching her lose everything and watching her choose kindness anyway, Adrian Romano had quietly decided that finding the truth was no longer simply a matter of curiosity. The next morning I woke before sunrise, not because I had somewhere to be, but because silence had become impossible to sleep through. My apartment felt unfamiliar without stacks of lesson plans covering the dining table or tomorrow's classroom activities waiting inside my canvas bag. I brewed coffee out of habit, then stared at the steam curling above the mug until it disappeared. Outside, the neighborhood slowly came alive. Garbage trucks rumbled through the streets. Joggers passed beneath trees that had already surrendered half their autumn leaves. Life continued with remarkable confidence, as though nothing important had happened. I wondered if healing worked the same way. Somewhere across the city, in the top floor of a glass office building overlooking the river, Adrian Romano closed a financial report without reading the final page. Numbers rarely distracted him. People did. Especially when they refused to fit the story everyone else accepted. His assistant stepped into the office carrying a leather folder. "Everything you requested is here," she said. Adrian opened it slowly. Claire Bennett. 27 years old. Elementary school teacher. Volunteer at Willow Creek Animal Rescue. No criminal history. Excellent performance reviews. Community scholarship recipient. Dozens of letters from grateful parents praising her patience and kindness. He turned another page. The rumors that had spread across Maplewood appeared surprisingly recent, almost synchronized, as though they had been planted instead of discovered. Anonymous accounts had published identical accusations within minutes of one another. Several posts repeated the exact same unusual phrases. Adrian leaned back in his chair. People lied every day. Patterns rarely did. "Who benefits?" he asked quietly. His head of security frowned. "Excuse me?" Adrian slid the folder across the desk. "Someone gains something if Claire Bennett loses everything. Find that person." The room fell silent. Everyone working for Adrian understood one rule. He never wasted resources on meaningless curiosity. If he asked for answers, he intended to find them. Less than an hour later, another report landed on his desk. A single name appeared repeatedly beside community events, charity committees, and school fundraising organizations. Rebecca Lawson. Former friend of Claire. Event coordinator. Recently engaged before the engagement ended unexpectedly 2 months earlier. Adrian studied the timeline. Claire had not attended the engagement party. Claire had not posted about it online. Claire had not publicly commented on the breakup. Yet somehow she had become the center of every conversation afterward. Coincidence felt increasingly unlikely. Meanwhile, I spent the morning organizing books I no longer needed to return to room 12. Every handwritten note from my students felt heavier than the last. One crayon drawing showed me standing beside a rainbow with the words, "Best teacher ever." Children measured people by how safe they felt around them. Adults preferred stories that entertained them. A knock interrupted my thoughts. Mrs. Hernandez, my elderly neighbor, stood outside holding a warm apple pie wrapped in a checkered towel. She smiled nervously. "I know people are talking," she said. "I just wanted you to know I am not listening." My throat tightened before I could answer. Sometimes Faith arrived quietly, carrying homemade dessert instead of dramatic speeches. After she left, I sat by the window watching the afternoon light stretch across the empty sidewalk. For the first time in days, I felt something fragile returning. Not hope exactly. Something smaller. The possibility that truth still had a few believers left. At that exact moment, Adrian closed the investigation file and circled one sentence with a fountain pen. "Every false story begins with someone who needs it to be believed." Then he looked out across the skyline, already knowing his next step would not begin with confronting Claire. It would begin with the person who had been hiding comfortably behind the whispers all along. I spent the next several days trying to rebuild a routine from the scattered pieces of the old one. Every morning I still woke before sunrise. Every morning I still packed a lunch before remembering I had nowhere to take it. Instead of sitting in room 12 reading stories to 22 curious faces, I found myself delivering meals through the community center's volunteer program. Mrs. Daniels, an 84-year-old widow with a collection of porcelain birds covering every shelf in her living room, greeted me with the same bright smile she always had. "You look tired, sweetheart," she said as she accepted the paper grocery bags from my arms. I laughed softly. "I think everyone can see that lately." She reached for my hand before I could leave. "Not everyone sees the important things." Those words stayed with me long after I drove away. Kindness had become strangely quiet these days. It no longer arrived in crowds. It appeared one person at a time, almost as though courage itself had become contagious only in whispers. That afternoon I stopped by the public library to return a stack of children's books I had borrowed for my students before everything changed. The librarian, Mr. Ellis, smiled exactly as he always had. He never mentioned the rumors. He simply scanned each book and asked whether I wanted to reserve the newest collection of classic fairy tales. His ordinary kindness nearly brought tears to my eyes because it reminded me that normal conversation still existed somewhere. As I walked toward the parking lot, I noticed a young mother struggling to lift a folded stroller while balancing grocery bags and comforting a crying toddler. Without thinking, I hurried over and carried the stroller down the steps. The little boy looked up at me with watery blue eyes before wrapping his tiny arms around my leg for half a second. His mother smiled with obvious relief. "Thank you. Everyone seems to be in such a hurry lately." I smiled back. Sometimes slowing down helps more. Neither of us realized someone had quietly observed the entire exchange from across the street. Adrian Romano lowered the window of his sedan just enough to hear the laughter between the child and the woman everyone insisted was selfish. He had spent 48 hours reviewing financial records, archived messages, and public timelines connected to Rebecca Lawson. The deeper he looked, the less sense the accusations against Claire made. Every verified fact contradicted the version of events spreading across Maplewood. Yet Claire herself had made no attempt to defend her reputation publicly. She had not posted emotional statements online. She had not blamed anyone. She had simply continued helping people who needed help. Adrian found that more convincing than any formal denial could ever be. His phone vibrated. "We found something," his head of security said. Several anonymous accounts that started the rumors were created from the same internet connection. They disappeared less than 24 hours after the story spread. Adrian remained silent for several seconds. Fabricated stories usually collapsed under careful examination, but this one had been planned with unusual precision. Someone had expected Claire to fight back. Instead, she had responded with grace, making the deception stand out even more clearly. He watched as Claire climbed into her aging Honda after helping the young family. She never looked around to see whether anyone had noticed. She simply drove away toward the animal shelter once again, choosing compassion over self-pity. Adrian rested one hand on the steering wheel and quietly reached a conclusion he had not expected when this began. He was no longer investigating because he doubted Claire Bennett. He was investigating because someone had underestimated the value of an honest person, and sooner or later, every carefully constructed lie left behind one small crack that only patience could find. By the end of the week, the world had become strangely smaller. Maplewood was never a large town to begin with, but once people decided to avoid you, every street felt twice as empty. I had stopped checking social media completely. The silence was healthier than reading strangers debate a version of my life that had never existed. Instead, I filled my evenings with lesson plans I might never teach again. Writing tomorrow's reading exercises gave me something to believe in, even if tomorrow belonged to someone else. Friday afternoon brought the first rain of the season. Soft drops tapped against my apartment windows while I sorted boxes of classroom supplies I had quietly brought home after being placed on leave. Every colored marker, every stack of construction paper, every handwritten birthday card from my students reminded me that my real life had been built one small act of kindness at a time. It seemed impossible that something so carefully built could be shaken by people who had never bothered to ask a single question. Across the city, another stack of papers landed on Adrian Romano's desk. Unlike financial reports, these pages told a story hidden beneath timestamps, deleted accounts, and forgotten messages. His investigators had reconstructed the first 48 hours after the rumors appeared. Every anonymous profile traced back through the same digital trail before disappearing almost immediately afterward. One account had made a mistake. It remained active just long enough to exchange private messages with a personal profile belonging to Rebecca Lawson. Adrian read every verified detail without speaking. There it was. The first visible crack. Not proof of everything, but enough to understand that the whispers had not been born naturally. They had been carefully guided. His security chief placed another folder beside him. We interviewed several people quietly. Nobody remembers hearing the story directly from Claire. They only remember hearing it from someone who heard it from someone else. Adrian nodded once. Rumors survived because they borrowed confidence from repetition. Truth demanded patience. Keep looking, he said calmly. Someone always remembers the first voice. Meanwhile, I received an unexpected phone call from Principal Collins. My heart pounded before I even answered. Claire, she said gently, I wanted you to hear this from me first. The school board has extended your leave while they continue reviewing community concerns. I closed my eyes, letting the disappointment settle before replying. Thank you for telling me personally. There was a long pause. For what it is worth, she whispered, I have taught for 32 years. I have learned that character reveals itself over time. I have not forgotten who you are. After we ended the call, I sat quietly beside my living room window watching rain slide down the glass. Losing another week at school hurt more than I wanted to admit, but Principal Collins had given me something the internet never could. She had given me the benefit of memory. She remembered years instead of headlines. That evening I carried fresh blankets to Willow Creek Animal Rescue. Murphy greeted me with the same joyful enthusiasm as always, spinning in happy circles until I laughed out loud for the first time in days. Linda smiled from across the room. There it is, she said. I was wondering when that smile would come back. I shrugged. I forgot what it sounded like. Neither of us noticed the black sedan slowing briefly on the road outside before continuing toward the highway. Adrian had not stopped this time. He no longer needed to observe Claire to understand who she was. His attention had shifted completely toward the person who had started all of this. As the city lights flickered on beneath the darkening sky, one final report arrived on his encrypted phone. It contained a calendar invitation for an upcoming charity gala where nearly everyone connected to the story would gather under one roof. Adrian read the guest list once, locked his screen, and quietly realized the truth would not need to chase anyone much longer. Soon, everyone responsible would walk willingly into the very room where the first real questions would finally be asked. Saturday morning arrived with a pale blue sky and the kind of crisp autumn air that made every breath feel clean. I had just finished feeding Murphy and the other dogs when Linda walked toward me carrying a cream-colored envelope sealed with dark blue wax. "This came for you about an hour ago," she said, turning it over in her hands. "No return address. It looks expensive." I frowned as I accepted it. The heavy paper felt strangely out of place in a small animal shelter where everything smelled like fresh pine shavings and puppy shampoo. Carefully breaking the seal, I unfolded a single card. The message was short. "Claire Bennett. You are cordially invited to the Romano Foundation Annual Children's Education Gala next Friday evening. Your presence would be greatly appreciated. Formal attire requested." I stared at the elegant lettering twice before looking back at Linda. There has to be some mistake. She adjusted her glasses and read the invitation over my shoulder. "Maybe not. The Romano Foundation gives scholarships all over the state." I shook my head slowly. "People like me do not receive invitations like this." Linda smiled knowingly. "Maybe people like you should." I slipped the invitation back into its envelope, unable to explain why my heart was suddenly racing. I had never heard of anyone named Adrian Romano, and I certainly had never met whoever believed I belonged at an event attended by wealthy donors and business leaders. Across the city, Adrian stood beside the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office overlooking the river while his event coordinator reviewed final preparations. "Every guest has confirmed except 3, she said. "Excellent," Adrian replied without turning around. "And Claire Bennett?" She glanced at her tablet. "The invitation was delivered this morning exactly as requested." Adrian nodded once. He had intentionally avoided attaching any explanation. If Claire accepted, she would arrive without expectations. If she declined, he would understand. Either way, the evening would move forward. Another member of his staff entered carrying a folder. "We confirmed it," he said quietly. "Rebecca Lawson is attending the gala as part of the community fundraising committee. Several members of the Maplewood School Board will also be there." Adrian closed his eyes briefly. The pieces were finally gathering in one place. He had spent years negotiating with executives, politicians, and influential investors. He understood that people rarely revealed themselves when questioned directly. They revealed themselves when they believed they were completely safe. Rebecca still believed exactly that. Back at the shelter, I continued cleaning kennels while the invitation remained tucked safely inside my bag. I tried convincing myself to ignore it, yet my thoughts returned to the elegant card every few minutes. During lunch, Linda sat beside me on an old wooden bench outside the shelter. "Are you going?" she asked. I laughed softly. "I do not even own a dress suitable for something like that." She smiled. "That sounds like a wardrobe problem, not a reason." I looked across the fenced field where Murphy chased falling leaves as though they were treasures worth catching. "I am not sure I belong in a room full of important people." Linda watched the dogs for a moment before answering. "Claire, the people who truly belong anywhere are usually the ones who never spend time wondering whether they deserve to be there. They simply show up and treat everyone kindly." Her words lingered long after I drove home. That evening I opened my closet and found the navy blue dress I had worn to my college graduation nearly 5 years earlier. It was simple, timeless, and still fit perfectly. I held it against the light, wondering whether it might be enough. Miles away, Adrian looked over the finalized seating chart one final time before quietly moving a single name. Claire Bennett would not be placed near donors, politicians, or executives. She would be seated where honesty, not influence, would become impossible for everyone else in the room to ignore. Friday evening arrived wrapped in golden light that slowly faded into the deep blue of early autumn. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror longer than I cared to admit, smoothing invisible wrinkles from the navy blue dress I had nearly decided not to wear. It was simple, with clean lines and no expensive designer label, but it reminded me of the woman I had been before strangers began rewriting my story. I slipped on a pair of pearl earrings my mother had given me after my college graduation, took one steady breath, and whispered to my reflection, "Just show up. That is enough." The Romano Foundation Gala was held inside the Grand Crescent Hotel overlooking the river. The building shimmered beneath hundreds of warm lights, its glass walls reflecting the city skyline like a painting. Luxury cars lined the entrance while guests in elegant gowns and tailored tuxedos climbed the marble steps beneath towering columns. I almost turned around the moment I parked my old Honda near the back of the lot. It looked painfully out of place beside polished luxury vehicles. For a brief moment, I wondered whether I belonged anywhere near this world. Then I remembered what Linda had told me. The people who belonged rarely questioned whether they deserved to be there. I straightened my shoulders and walked toward the entrance. Inside, a string quartet filled the ballroom with soft music while conversations drifted beneath sparkling chandeliers. Crystal glasses reflected golden light across polished floors. Everywhere I looked, people greeted one another with practiced smiles and confident handshakes. I quietly handed my invitation to the hostess, expecting confusion or embarrassment. Instead, she smiled warmly. "Welcome, Miss Bennett. We have been expecting you." Those words caught me completely off guard. Expecting me? Someone had planned for me to be here. A young attendant guided me through the ballroom toward a table near the front of the room. As we passed clusters of guests, I noticed several familiar faces from Maplewood. Members of the school board. Local business owners. Charity organizers. Even Rebecca Lawson stood near the stage wearing a beautiful emerald gown, laughing comfortably among a circle of influential donors. The moment her eyes met mine, her smile disappeared for the smallest fraction of a second before returning even brighter than before. She looked surprised. Almost unsettled. I lowered my gaze and continued walking. I had not come to confront anyone. I barely understood why I had been invited. Across the ballroom, Adrian Romano watched quietly from a private reception area overlooking the main floor. Dressed in a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, he acknowledged guests with polite nods while noticing details few others ever did. Claire entered without demanding attention. She thanked every staff member who offered directions. She complimented the pianist after accidentally passing near the stage. She smiled at servers carrying heavy trays instead of treating them as invisible. Every quiet gesture confirmed the same conclusion Adrian had reached days earlier. Character never needed an audience. His chief of security stepped beside him and spoke in a calm voice. "Everything is ready. Every guest connected to the investigation has arrived." Adrian glanced toward Rebecca, who continued greeting influential attendees with effortless confidence. "Good," he replied. "No interruptions until the presentation begins." The lights in the ballroom dimmed slightly as guests gradually found their assigned seats. A gentle hush settled across the room while waiters finished serving dinner. I unfolded the elegant place card resting in front of me and noticed something unexpected printed beneath my name. Guest of honor. My pulse quickened. There had to be some mistake. I looked around for someone who could explain why an elementary school teacher on administrative leave had been seated in such a prominent place. Before I could ask anyone, the master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage, welcomed everyone to the annual gala, and smiled toward the audience before announcing that this year's opening remarks would be delivered personally by the foundation's chairman, Adrian Romano. I had never heard the name Adrian Romano spoken out loud before that evening, yet the moment he stepped onto the stage the atmosphere inside the ballroom shifted in a way I could feel before I could explain it. Conversations faded naturally. Hundreds of people turned their attention toward him without being asked. He carried himself with quiet confidence instead of showmanship, wearing a perfectly tailored black tuxedo that somehow made him appear approachable and untouchable at the same time. His dark hair was neatly combed back, and the calm expression on his face revealed almost nothing, except for a pair of steady blue eyes that seemed to notice everything. He welcomed the guests with a warm voice that carried effortlessly across the ballroom. Instead of talking about success or wealth, he spoke about responsibility. He thanked teachers, volunteers, first responders, and community leaders whose daily efforts rarely appeared in headlines but quietly changed lives. Every sentence felt thoughtful rather than rehearsed. As he spoke, I found myself relaxing for the first time since arriving. Then he paused. The silence that followed lasted only a heartbeat, yet somehow it felt much longer. "Tonight," he said, "before we celebrate generosity, I would like to recognize someone who reminds us why integrity still matters." My hands tightened around the edge of the tablecloth. Surely he could not be talking about me. There were hundreds of remarkable people in the room. Philanthropists, educators, doctors, business owners. I lowered my eyes, hoping the moment would pass. Instead, I heard my own name. Claire Bennett. The room became perfectly still. I slowly looked up, convinced I had misunderstood. Adrian met my eyes from across the ballroom with the same calm expression he had worn since taking the stage. "Would you please join me?" My heartbeat echoed so loudly inside my chest that I barely noticed myself standing. Every step toward the stage felt impossibly long. I could sense people watching from every direction. Some looked confused. Others whispered quietly to the person beside them. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught Rebecca Lawson staring at me with an expression I had never seen before. It was not confidence anymore. It looked closer to uncertainty. When I reached the stage, Adrian offered a respectful smile before stepping slightly aside to give me space instead of placing me behind him. That single gesture surprised me more than anything else. He was introducing me as an equal, not displaying me as part of a presentation. "Miss Bennett," he said, "thank you for accepting our invitation." I managed a nervous smile. "I am still not entirely sure why I am here." A few gentle laughs rippled through the audience, easing the tension. Adrian nodded thoughtfully. "That is understandable. Sometimes the people most deserving of recognition are the least likely to expect it." He turned back toward the audience. "Over the past several days, many people have spoken confidently about this woman. I became curious because every verified fact I found described someone completely different from the rumors being repeated." The whispers throughout the ballroom grew louder. Several members of the Maplewood School Board exchanged uneasy glances. Rebecca's smile had disappeared completely. Adrian continued speaking without raising his voice. "Before forming opinions about anyone, I believe we owe them something very simple. We owe them the truth." Behind him, the large screen above the stage quietly illuminated with the Foundation's logo before fading to the first slide of a carefully prepared presentation. I looked toward Adrian in confusion. He gave the slightest reassuring nod, as though silently asking me to trust the next few minutes. I had no idea what he had discovered, but as the first document appeared on the screen and the entire ballroom leaned forward in complete silence, I realized the story everyone thought had already been written was only now about to begin. The first slide displayed nothing dramatic. It was simply a timeline. Clean. Precise. Undeniable. Dates appeared one beneath another, documenting public records, archived posts, verified messages, and community events. Adrian allowed the audience several quiet seconds to read before speaking again. "Facts are rarely as entertaining as rumors," he said calmly. "But they are considerably more dependable." The room remained silent except for the soft hum of the projector. He walked slowly across the stage without rushing a single word. The story repeated throughout Maplewood claimed that Claire Bennett interfered in someone else's engagement. That accusation spread across dozens of online accounts within less than 2 hours. The next slide appeared. A digital chart illustrated the identical wording used by anonymous profiles that had posted within minutes of one another. Several guests leaned closer to read. Others quietly adjusted their glasses. Independent investigators examined publicly available records and communication patterns, Adrian continued. An unusual detail emerged almost immediately. Nearly every account responsible for launching the accusation was created during the same 24-hour period. Most disappeared within the following day. A ripple of quiet conversation moved across the ballroom. I stood beside him completely speechless. I had not known any of this. I had never tried to investigate because surviving each day had already consumed everything I had. Adrian pressed a small remote. Another document appeared. This time it displayed timestamps connecting the anonymous accounts through the same internet connection before highlighting verified communications linked to Rebecca Lawson's public profile. Nobody gasped. The silence was too complete for that. Rebecca slowly rose from her chair as though preparing to object, but the confidence she had carried all evening seemed to vanish beneath the weight of the evidence quietly appearing one page after another. Adrian never looked toward her. He addressed the audience instead. Tonight is not about humiliating anyone. It is about demonstrating how easily assumptions replace truth when nobody pauses to ask a single question. His voice remained steady, almost gentle. Miss Bennett never responded publicly. She never attacked anyone online. She never attempted to damage another person's reputation in return. The screen changed again. Letters from parents filled the display. Handwritten notes from former students. Community service records. Volunteer hours logged over several years. Scholarship recognitions. Recommendation letters. A lifetime measured not by one rumor but by thousands of ordinary choices. Tears blurred my vision before I realized they had begun falling. Adrian quietly stepped farther away from me, allowing the audience to focus entirely on the evidence rather than the emotions unfolding beside him. Character, he said softly, is not established by one accusation. Character is established by consistent actions over time. Across the ballroom, members of the Maplewood School Board lowered their eyes. Several community leaders exchanged uncomfortable glances. Principal Margaret Collins slowly stood from her table, her expression filled with quiet conviction rather than surprise. She began applauding. The sound echoed alone for only a moment before another pair of hands joined her. Then another. Within seconds, the ballroom filled with respectful applause that seemed to grow stronger with every heartbeat. It was not loud because people felt obligated. It was powerful because many suddenly recognized the cost of believing something they had never verified. I looked across the room and noticed faces that had once avoided me. Some smiled through tears. Others could not bring themselves to meet my eyes at all. Adrian finally turned toward me with the same calm expression he had worn all evening. He spoke quietly enough that only I could hear. The truth does not always arrive first, he said. But when it finally walks into the room, even the loudest rumor usually forgets how to speak. The applause continued long after the presentation ended, but I barely heard it anymore. Everything around me felt distant, softened by the overwhelming realization that someone I had never met had spent days uncovering a truth I had almost stopped believing anyone would care about. One by one, guests approached the stage. Some offered quiet congratulations. Others apologized with voices that trembled beneath the weight of regret. A member of the Maplewood School Board extended his hand and admitted they should have asked questions before making decisions. Another community leader confessed she had shared the rumors without verifying a single fact. None of those conversations erased what had happened, but something important shifted inside me as I listened. People were finally speaking to me instead of speaking about me. That difference mattered more than I expected. Rebecca Lawson had quietly left the ballroom before the applause ended. No dramatic confrontation followed her departure. No angry voices echoed through the elegant hall. She simply disappeared into the night, leaving behind a silence that somehow revealed more than any argument could have. Adrian never mentioned her again. He never celebrated proving someone wrong. Instead, he thanked the guests for supporting education and reminded everyone that every community became stronger when fairness replaced assumptions. His final words earned another standing ovation, not because they were theatrical, but because they were true. As dinner concluded, guests slowly filtered toward the grand ballroom doors. Several teachers from neighboring districts introduced themselves and thanked me for my years of service. Parents I had never met spoke kindly about their own children and the importance of educators who cared beyond the classroom. For the first time in weeks, strangers looked into my eyes without suspicion. They saw a person instead of a rumor. I quietly stepped onto the outdoor terrace overlooking the river, needing a moment to breathe. The evening air carried the scent of autumn leaves and cool water while the city lights shimmered across the gentle current below. Behind me, the music continued softly through the ballroom windows. Footsteps approached without hurry. I already knew who it was before I turned around. Adrian Romano stopped several feet away, respecting the quiet space between us. Neither of us spoke immediately. We simply watched the river flowing beneath the bridge, steady and patient, as though it had witnessed countless stories like this before. Finally, I broke the silence. Why? The single word escaped more quietly than I intended. Adrian looked toward the water before answering. Because something did not make sense. I shook my head gently. You had no reason to spend your time helping someone you did not even know. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that lasted only a moment but reached his eyes. I did have a reason. I waited. Years ago, he said, someone judged a member of my family before learning the truth. I watched what that kind of mistake could do. Ever since then, whenever I have the ability to prevent it from happening again, I try. His voice carried no bitterness, only quiet certainty. I studied him for a long moment. The powerful businessman standing beside me was not driven by pride or recognition. He had never asked for credit. In fact, if he had wanted attention, he could have revealed everything days earlier. Instead, he had waited until facts could speak louder than opinions. Thank you, I whispered. Adrian slowly shook his head. Do not thank me for doing what should have been ordinary. The words settled deeply inside me. He was right. Defending the truth should never have been extraordinary. Asking questions before passing judgment should never have been considered remarkable. Yet somehow those simple acts had become rare enough to feel heroic. As we stood together beneath the quiet autumn sky, I realized that although the rumors had stolen weeks of my life, they had also introduced me to someone who understood that real strength was never measured by how loudly a person could command a room, but by how quietly they chose to stand beside someone who had been left standing alone. The following Monday morning felt different before I even opened my eyes. Nothing around me had changed. My apartment was still the same quiet place with lesson plans stacked neatly on the dining table and children's drawings taped to the refrigerator. The coffee maker still hummed softly as dawn painted pale orange light across the kitchen floor. Yet the weight I had been carrying for weeks had become lighter, not because everyone suddenly agreed with me, but because I no longer needed their permission to know who I was. Just after 8 o'clock, my phone rang. The caller identification displayed Maplewood Elementary School. I took a slow breath before answering. Good morning, Claire, Principal Margaret Collins said warmly. This time there was relief in her voice instead of hesitation. The school board met early this morning. They voted unanimously to end your administrative leave immediately. If you are willing, we would be honored to welcome you back. I closed my eyes as tears quietly gathered again. Only this time they did not come from heartbreak. Yes, I whispered. I would love to come back. Margaret laughed gently. I thought you might say that. I should also warn you that several parents have already called asking when their children will have their favorite teacher again. After the call ended, I stood in complete silence, letting those simple words settle into my heart. Favorite teacher. Not because of one presentation. Not because of one influential businessman. Because children remembered the person who had shown up for them every single day. By lunchtime I was walking through the familiar halls of Maplewood Elementary once again. Teachers smiled without uncertainty. Office staff welcomed me with warm embraces. Even the school custodian, Mr. Jenkins, tipped his baseball cap and said, "Good to have you home, Miss Bennett." When I opened the door to room 12, colorful paper stars covered every bulletin board. My students rushed toward me with excited voices, each one talking louder than the last. Small hands wrapped around my arms and waist in joyful hugs. One little girl looked up at me with complete sincerity and asked, "Did you have a long vacation?" I smiled through happy tears. Something like that. Children had a remarkable gift. They accepted people without carrying yesterday into today. Across town, Adrian Romano stood near the windows of his office watching boats move slowly along the river. His assistant entered carrying several newspapers. Each featured articles about the Foundation Gala and the importance of verifying information before spreading accusations. Adrian barely glanced at the headlines. Recognition had never been the goal. His phone buzzed with a brief message from his chief of security. Case closed. Adrian looked out across the skyline for another moment before replying with only 3 words. Delete the file. There was no need to preserve evidence that had already restored someone's life. Some victories belonged in memories instead of archives. Late that afternoon, as my students boarded their buses, I discovered a small envelope resting on my classroom desk. There was no signature. Inside rested a handwritten note on thick cream paper. It contained only one sentence. Never allow the opinions of impatient people to become louder than the truth you quietly live every day. Beneath the message was a small pressed maple leaf, perfectly preserved between 2 sheets of parchment. I smiled immediately because I recognized the stationery from the gala invitation. Folding the note carefully, I placed it inside the drawer where I kept letters from former students. It belonged there because, like those letters, it reminded me of something lasting. Respect earned through actions always outlived attention earned through noise. Standing alone in my classroom as the afternoon sunlight stretched across rows of tiny desks, I realized Adrian Romano had never tried to become the hero of my story. Instead, he had quietly returned the pen to the person who should have been writing it all along. Several weeks passed before I saw Adrian Romano again. By then winter had begun quietly settling over Maplewood. The maple trees that had once covered the sidewalks with brilliant shades of red and gold now stood bare against pale gray skies. Inside room 12, however, life remained wonderfully loud. Children still argued about crayons, celebrated perfect spelling tests as though they had won Olympic medals, and believed every Friday deserved an extra story before the last bell. Their laughter slowly filled the empty places the past had left behind. One Saturday morning the community gathered for the annual Winter Reading Festival, an event cancelled only once in its 40-year history because of a blizzard. Families crowded the town square carrying cups of hot chocolate while local musicians played cheerful holiday songs beneath strings of white lights. Volunteers collected books for children whose families could not easily afford them. A month earlier I would have wondered whether anyone wanted me there. Now parents greeted me with genuine smiles. Some apologized once more, although they no longer needed to. Forgiveness had quietly replaced resentment because holding on to bitterness would only have allowed the rumors to keep stealing pieces of my future. I spent the morning helping children choose books that matched their interests. Adventure stories for the dreamers. Animal stories for the gentle hearts. Science books for the endlessly curious. Near noon I noticed a familiar black sedan parked across the street. Adrian stepped out wearing a dark wool coat instead of a tuxedo, blending surprisingly well into the ordinary crowd. There were no television cameras. No speeches. No security surrounding him. He carried 2 large boxes filled with brand new children's books and quietly placed them beside the donation table before greeting the volunteers with the same respectful warmth he had shown every staff member at the gala. When our eyes finally met, he smiled politely and walked over. "Looks like you found your classroom again," he said. I laughed softly. It turns out they had been saving my desk. He glanced toward the children excitedly comparing their new books. I had a feeling they would. We stood together watching a little boy proudly read his very first paragraph aloud to his younger sister. Neither of us interrupted the moment. Some victories deserved silence more than applause. After several minutes I turned toward Adrian. "You know," I said, "people still ask me who saved me." He shook his head gently. they ask the wrong question. I raised an eyebrow. What should they ask? He looked toward the children gathered around the reading corner before answering. They should ask why it became so easy for good people to doubt someone they had known for years. His words stayed with me long after the festival ended because they reached beyond my story. Rumors changed names. Communities changed. Technology changed. Human nature rarely did. The choice to pause before judging someone would always matter. As the afternoon sun dipped lower, families slowly made their way home carrying books beneath their arms and smiles across their faces. Adrian picked up his coat and prepared to leave. Before walking away, he stopped beside me one final time. "Take care of those children," he said. "The world will need adults who know how to think before they repeat what they hear." I smiled. "I will." He nodded once and disappeared into the crowd without waiting for recognition. I watched until the black sedan blended into the quiet traffic beyond the town square. Then I looked back toward the children laughing over stories that would teach them about courage, kindness, and truth. Looking back now, I understand that rumors do not disappear because everyone suddenly becomes perfect. They disappear when enough ordinary people choose honesty over excitement, patience over assumptions, and compassion over convenience. Reputation can be wounded in a single afternoon, but character is written every day, one quiet decision at a time, and in the end, the loudest voice is never the one that shouts the longest. It is the one that never stopped telling the truth.